The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept it, and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the seventh and final day of this November 2022 sesshin at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I want to go a little further into one of the barriers to our Zen practice. As we begin to do Zen, it's all a new and different experience. It's interesting. There are some challenges, getting the posture down right, figuring out how to do the extended out breath, and the various different processes we go through. And then we begin to get that down. And then various things can happen. We can still maintain a level of excitement and a need to know, a need to understand, a need to find out what is beyond what we ordinarily think and feel. And that's what draws us to practice, really. The other thing that can draw us to practice is a level of suffering. But over history, there have been very many famous Zen masters who in their early years of practice became discouraged. I spoke of Rinzai, who has an entire lineage still extant, one of the two lineages of Zen still actively being practiced many centuries later, who, upon being asked or suggested that he go and ask the master a question, a basic fundamental question in Zen, which is really our fundamental Zen question. And each time he went, Obaku said, "I spare you 60 blows." What did that mean? When a student is ripe, a teacher can say something. We can, as a student, see something, hear something, and it triggers an awakening experience. We never know when that might happen, but a ripening prior to that is essential. And in this particular case, even though Obaku tried 3 times to bring Rinzai to awakening, Rinzai wasn't ready. And instead, he got discouraged. He thought, I don't have what it takes to do Zen practice. I can't figure out what the teacher is trying to tell me. This is very confusing. Maybe I'm not cut out for it. And of course, we know the story that when he went to say his goodbyes, Obaku said to go to a particular other teacher, and he did. And of course, during that long walk, probably days or weeks, to get to the other temple, he was pondering this, trying to figure out what was he missing? What had he done wrong? Was he not fit for Zen practice? And it really bit into him. And he really turned it over and over and over and over. And it wouldn't let him go. And of course, then we also know that when he reached the other Zen master and explained what had happened or related what had happened, the other Zen master said, "You idiot. Obaku was acting like a caring grandmother, feeding you the Dharma. And you just ignored it?" And at that, Rinzai had an awakening experience. And he had that awakening experience because he kept on trying to figure it out. Not through words. I mean, there was no way he could figure that out through words. It just didn't match. His going and asking an innocent question that had been suggested to him by the head monk, and then he got that reaction. It made no sense at all. And when it doesn't make any sense, that's when, if we don't abandon that, we can find ourselves going profoundly deep and even have a kensho like Rinzai did. Another one was Kyogen, who had a similar situation. And he got so discouraged, there was no one to tell him to go visit a different teacher. He was so discouraged, he felt like he was not cut out for Zen practice. And so at least what he could do would be to go and take care of the fallen down memorial cemetery plot of an ancient Zen teacher, one that was highly respected. At least he would be worth that. And so he went, and all the time, and this is important, all the time he was really, really worrying. What was it? What was it? What was it? And then when he was sweeping the courtyard there, and a broken tile hit a bamboo and made a tok sound, that triggers an awakening for him. In more modern times, Mitra-roshi had met Mumon-roshi on a bus. Prior to that, he had absolutely no interest in Zen practice. He was born and raised into a Zen temple. His father actually had trained at Shofukuji, although most likely not to become a teacher. And so he grew up with his father being something that is actually disdained in Japan to this day, which was essentially a funeral director. When people get married in Japan, they get married in Shinto ceremonies, unless they're older and it's a repeat marriage. And then they will come and get married in a Zen temple sometimes. But then when they die, it's a Buddhist ceremony. And there's a Japanese movie that really parodies this. You see the grandfather clutching his heart and then crawling out onto the deck to look at the moon in hopes that that would make a difference, and dying. And so then the family has the funeral. And you first see this enormous, fancy car pulling into the driveway. And then you see the gathered family from behind. They're sitting on the tatami with no cushions, and they're beginning to wiggle and struggle as this priest drones on. And it goes on like that. And that's the view that Japanese normally have of Zen priests or Buddhist priests. And the Buddhist priests have come up with some curious solutions to this phenomenon. And in order to avoid becoming funeral directors, they've done odd things, like there's one Buddhist priest who runs a bar, which is really a bizarre thing for a Buddhist priest to do, because to cause others to get drunk, and believe me, alcoholism is a big problem in Japan, is against the precepts. We don't want to cloud our minds, whether it's with alcohol or drugs, or with anything else for that matter. There's many things that we can cloud our minds with that aren't necessarily chemicals. But and there are various different things. And Myoshinji, which is the venerated headquarter temple of the Rinzai sect, one of 14 actually. And it was founded in the mid-600s in Japan. This is a very long time ago. And over the centuries, since then, it has grown. It's common for students who become teachers to, if they can't inherit the temple that they trained in, to have a sub-temple on the temple grounds built for them. And so Myoshinji has grown to the point where it has 44 temples on this vast acreage. And during the Meiji era, when Buddhism really came under the gun, and many temples were destroyed, many people just no longer supported Buddhist temples. And so they had to, in order to survive, come up with some other way of providing income. And within that 44 temple complex, only 4 temples are actually to this day teaching temples. There are a couple of kindergartens. There are a couple of bed and breakfasts. There is one that maintains its Japanese garden and charges entry fees for that. I'm not sure what the rest of them do, if anything, to simply survive. But I'm straying. At any rate, so Haridaroshi had no interest in becoming a Buddhist priest. He didn't want to become a funeral director. Instead, early on, he wanted to become a rocket scientist. Actually, he wanted to be a rocket pilot. And then later on, as he grew older, because he really saw that he had some things he needed to work on in his own personality, he felt like he really should become a psychologist. And that's what he majored in college. But when his father sent him on an errand to take some papers to a temple in the Myoshinji complex, one of the teaching temples, by the way, and he had to go on an earlier bus in order to get also back to his classes at university in time, he encountered Yamada Mitra-roshi, and the encounter changed his life. Mitra-roshi was profoundly quiet, simple, and although dressed in priest robes, which really surprised young Harada, he simply went to the back of the bus, opened a small book, and began to read. And Harada was entranced by this and delighted when it turns out that they both got off at the same bus stop and they both went to the same final location, which was Reiyuin, one of the sub-temples of Myoshinji. At the time, Mitra-roshi was the abbot of that. So after Haridaroshi graduated from Hanazono University, I think it was, in Kyoto, he walked overland from Kyoto to Kobe, Japan, and entered Shofukuji Monastery under Yamada Mitra-roshi, going to every single sesshin, and there were sesshin every month there, as there are here at Mountain Gate. And he did his best, diving into the practice, sesshin after sesshin after sesshin. And Rohatsu sesshin, which is the most intense sesshin of the year ordinarily, and he didn't get Kensho? Well, he put another year into it, another Rohatsu, and still didn't get Kensho. There was some high expectations, by the way. He went into Mitra-roshi's quarters and said, "I'm leaving." And Mitra-roshi simply nodded. And so Harada went and lived in the woods, in the mountains, for a year, actually, moving around, camping in different places in the mountains. There are a lot of mountains in Japan. It's all mountainous, actually. And then one day, a group of people, a small group of people, I think something like 5 or 6 people, came up a trail nearby which Harada was sitting in Zazen. And when they saw him, they said, "Oh, are you a Zen monk?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "You are so amazingly fortunate. We can only come up here to do Zazen once a week because of our jobs. And in Japan, the work week is quite long, both in hours per day and also in days per week. It's basically pretty much a 6-day week. Now, there's a rebellion been going on more recently about that, but at the time, that was how it was. And these people were so amazed that Harada would have such a gift of being able to practice full time. And suddenly, he had a very deep awakening experience. And he realized that all he had to do in life was simply to receive what came to him. Simply to receive. Simply to receive. And that's how he has lived his life ever since. And he is only 8 months older than I am. So out of discouragement came deep awakening. Centuries before, in Japan also, Hakuin, who had started doing Zen practice because he was terrified of falling into hell and thought that becoming a Zen monk would keep him safe from falling into hell. And so he was practicing until I think he was 19. He was ordained when he was 14, I believe. And when he was 19, he learned that Ganto, who was a very famous Chinese Zen master, had been skewered by bandits. And when that happened, he was killed, he was murdered. He yelled out a cry that was so loud it was heard for 3 leagues. And a league is, I believe, is 3 miles. So 9 miles away, they heard him yelling, or one yell. And when Hakuin heard that, he was incredibly discouraged. How could a Zen master as eminent as Ganto scream when he was being murdered? How could that happen? What good was the Zen practice if that's all it came to for Ganto? And Hakuin quit doing his practice and apprenticed himself to a calligrapher. And after many months of working with the calligrapher, and normally an apprenticeship in Japan lasts 7 years, Hakuin realized that he was not going to make it as a calligrapher, which is ironic because he was an incredibly prolific calligrapher. And so he was casting about, what could he do with his life then if he wasn't going to be a decent level calligrapher? And he entered a temple courtyard where they were airing the scrolls, which they do twice a year in Japan. Japan is a very, very damp country, and everything gets moldy, seriously moldy. And so every year they open up the scrolls on a sunny day and lay them out to dry out. And then they roll them back up with a kind of powder in them that prevents, or discourages at least, insects from coming in and eating the paper. Silverfish will make holes in scrolls if you're not careful. And so he thought, okay, I'm just going to look to one of these scrolls and see if it gives me a direction to turn my life to. And he closed his eyes and put his finger down in the middle of one of the scrolls. And then he opened it, and it happened to land on the story of another ancient Chinese Zen master who was so determined in his practice that he held an awl, AWL, is a tool that was originally used for drilling holes. And it's just simply a sharp-pointed tool. We have them today in modern toolboxes too, although I'm not sure how much they're used. And when I was living in Japan, I used one to drill holes to create Japanese bound books. But at any rate, it's a very sharp object, and so he held this thing at his thigh, so that whenever he started to drift off, he'd punch it into his thigh, and the pain of it would wake him up. And eventually, he became a great Zen master. There is a kind of I don't know what you call it. It's a piece of wood that is notched at the top. It kind of has points at the edge, and it's about this wide and long enough that a Zen master will hold it in his lap, and if his head begins to drop as he begins to fall asleep, it'll kind of get him right here and wake him up. I have seen this piece of equipment at Sogenji. I don't know that Mitra-roshi uses it, but he might. For all I know, he does Zazen very long hours. He is quite determined to bring as many people to awakening as possible, and for good reason. To experience the freedom of awakening, even a small little kensho, and hopefully that will only motivate us to go more deep than that, many levels more deep than that. It changes our life in such amazing positive ways. But you already heard how many eminent Zen masters encountered discouragement. I've said in talks before and shared with people how at a certain point I was quite discouraged. And before that, I was discouraged the whole time, to be honest. And the only reason I kept doing Zen practice was that I had had an experience before I ever started Zen practice that made me realize that there was nothing in the world that I could count on to bring me lasting happiness. That the only way to find that was to go within. And several months later, my life crashed. And I had the opportunity to begin Zen practice. I encountered somebody who actually was a member of the Rochester Zen Center, and handed me a little book that was Roshi Kapleau's second book, called The Wheel of Death. And it was about Zen masters' stories of dying so peacefully, so at ease. How could they do that? Here I was in turmoil. And there were people in the past who had been so free of anxiety, fear, turmoil, trauma, no matter what their history was, that they could die in peace, simply not breathing in again. Yogye Mingye Rinpoche is a current Tibetan Buddhist teacher who has written an extraordinarily beautiful book on a pilgrimage that he did, in which he encountered his own death. He was pulled back from the brink at the last moment, and soon enough to save his life. And that is what makes that book so amazing, because he describes essentially every minute of it, his mind states, his openness to walking into the knowledge, the firm knowledge, and the experience of dying. He had some form of dysentery, it appears, and he had become also quite dehydrated as well. So again, he was rescued just in time, but the description of the willingness to walk into sure knowledge that he was dying. The only thing that he mentions about it that brought tears to his eyes was that he would not see his mother again. And that was saddening for him. At any rate, his father was also an eminent Tibetan Buddhist teacher. And his father was dying, sitting on a bed, surrounded by his sons, all of whom were actually Buddhist teachers of great eminence. And he was just simply sitting there. At one point, he asked to be helped to go to the bathroom, so they helped him do that. And then he was back sitting on his bed, and then he died. And they didn't even realize it until one of them noticed that he actually was no longer breathing. No anxiety, no fear. Simply receiving what came to him and allowing it to be. That's how we work with discouragement. All manner of mind states are going to come up as we do our practice, because our practice is about almost like taking a flashlight and looking into all the corners, nooks and crannies of our mind and seeing what's hidden there and what is driving us, because it will drive us even if it's not conscious. And many of us come to Zen practice with a negative self-image, and that will come to the fore as well. And that is probably the root of discouragement. We're not good enough, we think. We can't do it, we think. We'll fail, we think. But the truth is, that's simply an inner barrier that with deep awareness and firm practice, we can melt. It can come up right from the beginning, but then there's another time that it can come up. And this happened to myself, and I've told a number of you of this. I had been really, really working hard because I knew that was the only thing I could do. And I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere in my practice. For the first several years, I felt like I was getting nowhere. I couldn't, in some sesshin, many sesshin early on, I couldn't even remember what koan I was supposed to be working on. And it was simply Mu, the breakthrough koan, but I just simply couldn't even remember it halfway through the sesshin. So comes the sesshin, and on the seventh day, it's like I felt like I just was tired of the whole thing. And I had no interest in practice. Absolutely none, zero. It was kind of an odd experience to have when you still had a whole day's worth of zazen that you were in the zendo to do, and you couldn't exactly walk out. And the next sesshin, the same thing happened on the 6th day, and it continued into the 7th day. And the next sesshin, it happened on the 5th day. And so the next three days of sesshin were the same. Absolutely no interest in doing zazen. And moreover, I realized I didn't want to get any level of awakening. That was what came to mind, at least. The reality of it is that I was kind of, when we do Zen practice, we're like driving with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. And in those sessions, I was putting my foot on the brake harder and harder and harder. I was trying to stop myself from coming to awakening. And it turns out that that was timed very close to when I was passed on my koan. And what happened was that I was sort of nonplussed by this experience, and I could see how it was going to continue, and eventually I was going to go a whole 7 days in that condition, and it was not going to be pleasant. And so I went to talk to Roshi Kapleau about it and ask his advice. But it was not possible to go directly to Roshi Kapleau. You had to go through his secretary. And so I did. And in order to get an appointment with the Roshi to talk about these things, you had to tell his secretary exactly what you wanted to talk to him about. And so I spilled the beans to Bowden, who is the secretary. And Bowden went to the Roshi at some point later, and the answer came back that the Roshi would not see me. So I took a deep breath and realized I was going to have to figure this one out for myself. And I went ahead and applied to the next sesshin. I thought somehow something's going to happen. And I was turned down. The first sesshin ever that I had applied to, I was turned down. And I was applying to every single sesshin that I was eligible for. And my heart sank, and I suddenly realized I really did want to come to awakening. And so that's another time discouragement can come about as a last-ditch effort for part of us to prevent that freedom from being realized. So take heart in that. If you're discouraged, it could be because of that. It could be because you're, in essence, too close for comfort. Because it was only about 2 sesshin after that I was passed on my koan. How to deal with this? Because it can feel like it's impossible to deal with. First of all, to recognize that we will go through all kinds of mind states in our practice. And the most important thing to do with them is to explore them. Not analyze them, but explore them. And if we have come into Zen practice to a certain degree shut down, dissociated, we have an investment in that dissociation, because to feel, which is what dissociation prevents, to feel our feelings is not comfortable. It can even be frightening. It can even be terrifying. And so we try not to, by coming up with all kinds of things. We think a lot, where our head is full of thoughts, or we don't, we go through life not paying enough attention to doing things that we miss sometimes, or more frequently, miss more frequently. People say something to us, and it just goes, as my mother would say, in one ear and out the other. And there's a reason for that, because we don't want to hear it, because we're so accustomed to hearing things that are challenging to us in very painful or negative ways that we tune out. And so it can be difficult when you have an uncomfortable mind state to tune into that mind state, because we're so conditioned, so practiced in tuning out. But practice is important. And we can reach a point where we can tune in. We can reach a point where we can feel fully what's going on inside our bodies, this felt sense, the energy in our body. And that is phenomenally freeing, even if it's a negative feeling. The thing is, these feelings start to come up, and then boom, to escape, we go up into our head. And we sort of know that we're angry or frightened or even terrified or annoyed or whatever, but we're not really feeling it. And feeling it is what will free us from whatever it is, so that it just goes right through us. There's nothing to catch us. So that's another source of discouragement, is when we feel like we're pushing up against a wall. I can't tell you how long I felt that in my early years in Zen. I didn't even know how to identify the wall. I didn't even know where I was in relation to the wall. I just felt blocked. I just felt like there was something somewhere that I was just almost like stuck in a deep fog, unable to move forward or backward or in any direction that made any sense or had any release. But I persisted. And if you persist, you too will find that freedom. And it will be worth every ounce of effort it took to reach it. So discouragement is just a mind state. That's all. It's just sensations in your body. It's most likely driven by things that you were taught about yourself that are inaccurate. Because every human being is endowed with this phenomenal beingness that is life. And you can realize it yourself. And when you do, particularly if you take it deeper and deeper and deeper, you'll find it incredible. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.